My brother Nathaniel got the family business while I got nothing. Then I revealed I'm his biggest creditor, and the look on his face was absolutely priceless. I'm 31 years old, and I never thought I'd be sitting across from my entire family watching them squirm as I held all the cards. But here we are. And honestly, the irony is so perfect it almost feels scripted. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Let me tell you something about family businesses and golden children. They're both myths that can destroy relationships faster than you can say inheritance. For 28 years of my life, I believed in both of those myths. I believed that our family's importing company, Clearwater Maritime Solutions, was some kind of sacred legacy that needed to be preserved at all costs. I believed that my older brother was somehow more deserving, more capable, more everything than I could ever be. And I believed that good daughters just smile, nod, and accept whatever scraps fall from the table. Well, those days are over. You see, while everyone was busy treating Nathaniel like the chosen heir to Dad's throne, I was quietly building something they never bothered to notice. While they were discussing his MBA coursework over Sunday dinners and planning his grand entrance into the company, I was working 16-hour days, saving every penny, and making moves that would make their heads spin if they actually paid attention to what I was doing with my life. But they didn't pay attention. They never did. The thing about being the overlooked daughter in a family that worships their precious son is that you become invisible in the most useful way possible. You learn to move through the world without anyone questioning your decisions, without anyone monitoring your bank accounts, and without anyone thinking you're capable of anything that might threaten their perfectly ordered little hierarchy. That invisibility became my superpower. While Nathaniel was learning about market analysis and supply chain management in his fancy business school classes, I was actually living it. While he was networking at university mixers and talking about his future plans, I was building relationships with real suppliers, real manufacturers, and real money lenders who didn't care about my last name or my gender. They cared about my credit score and my ability to deliver on promises. See, here's what my family never understood about me. I didn't want their business because I thought I deserved it. I didn't fight for recognition because I needed their validation. I simply saw opportunities where they saw obstacles, and I had the audacity to act on those opportunities without asking permission from anyone. 3 years ago, when Dad announced at our annual family barbecue that he was officially handing over Clearwater Maritime to Nathaniel, I didn't throw a tantrum. I didn't demand explanations. I didn't even look surprised. I just smiled, congratulated my brother, and went home to review the financial documents I'd been quietly collecting for months. You want to know what those documents showed me? They showed me that dear old Dad's successful business was hanging on by a thread, held together with outdated contracts, aging equipment, and a customer base that was shrinking faster than a wool sweater in hot water. They showed me that Nathaniel was about to inherit a beautiful disaster, and nobody in my family had bothered to look beneath the surface to see the cracks in the foundation. But I saw them, and more importantly, I saw an opportunity. While Nathaniel was celebrating his new position and my parents were patting themselves on the back for keeping the business in the family, I was making phone calls. I was reviewing loan applications, I was calculating interest rates and risk assessments. I was doing what our family should have been doing all along. I was treating this like a business instead of a legacy. Over the past 3 years, as Nathaniel has struggled to keep Clearwater Maritime afloat, he's had to secure multiple loans to cover operating expenses, equipment repairs, and payroll shortfalls. Each time he needed money, he went to banks, private lenders, and investment groups, always managing to find someone willing to take the risk on a, quote, family business with potential. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that many of those loans were coming from companies that I either owned outright or had significant financial stakes in. Through a network of LLCs, investment partnerships, and carefully structured financial arrangements, I had quietly positioned myself as one of the largest creditors in my brother's failing empire.
Every time Nathaniel signed another loan document, every time he celebrated securing new funding, every time my parents praised his resourcefulness in keeping the business alive, he was essentially borrowing money from me. And I was charging him market rates with all the standard terms and conditions, including the right to call in those debts if certain performance metrics weren't met. Those performance metrics, well, let's just say they haven't been met. Last month, Clearwater Maritime missed its third consecutive quarterly payment on what Nathaniel thinks is a loan from Meridian Capital Group. What he doesn't know is that Meridian Capital Group is wholly owned by Delacroix Holdings, which is a subsidiary of my main investment company, Raven Financial Solutions. In simple terms, my brother owes me $2.3 million, and according to the contracts he signed, I have the legal right to demand immediate full repayment or seize company assets to cover the debt. The family meeting where I reveal this information is scheduled for tomorrow afternoon at 2 p.m. in the same conference room where Dad announced Nathaniel's inheritance 3 years ago. My parents think we're gathering to discuss emergency funding options to save the business. Nathaniel thinks he's meeting with potential new investors who might be willing to restructure his debt. They have no idea that their potential savior and their biggest threat are the same person. They have no idea that the daughter they overlooked, the sister they underestimated, and the woman they never thought was business-minded enough to understand their world is about to become the most important person in that room. Tomorrow I'm going to watch my family realize that the quiet girl who never fought for attention was actually playing a completely different game. Tomorrow I'm going to show them what happens when you mistake silence for weakness and invisibility for irrelevance. And tomorrow Nathaniel is going to learn that sometimes the person who got nothing is actually the person who got everything. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I'm Elena Vasquez, and honestly, I never expected my life to become this complicated chess game where I'm playing against my own family. Growing up in Millbrook Heights, I always thought family meant having each other's backs, not calculating interest rates on each other's failures. But here we are. And I guess that's what happens when you're raised to believe that love comes with conditions and respect has to be earned through bank statements. Let me give you the full picture of who I am, because it matters for what's coming next. I'm a certified public accountant with a master's degree in finance from Riverside University, and I've been working in corporate restructuring for the past 8 years. That means I specialize in taking businesses that are drowning in debt and either saving them or gracefully dismantling them for parts. It's not the most glamorous job in the world, but it taught me how to read between the lines of financial statements and spot trouble long before it becomes obvious to everyone else. My specialty is what we call distressed asset acquisition. Essentially, I help investment groups buy up the debt of failing companies at a discount, then either work with the company to restructure their obligations or exercise our rights as creditors to recover our investment through asset liquidation. It sounds cold when you put it like that, but it's actually a necessary part of how the business world works. Companies fail, debts need to be paid, and someone has to make the hard decisions about what happens next. What makes my situation unique is that I've never had to use these skills on my own family before. I never planned to become my brother's creditor. I never intended to put myself in a position where I might have to choose between family loyalty and financial responsibility. But sometimes life forces you into corners you never expected to occupy, and you have to decide whether you're going to be a victim of circumstances or the architect of your own solutions. The truth is, I've always been different from the rest of my family. While they were focused on tradition, legacy, and keeping things the way they've always been, I was fascinated by numbers, patterns, and the mathematical logic that governs how money moves through the world. While Nathaniel was learning to charm clients and schmooze at business dinners, I was studying market trends and learning how to spot opportunities that other people missed. My parents, Victor and Carmen Vasquez, built their entire identity around Clearwater Maritime Solutions. Dad started the company in 1987 with a single shipping container and a dream of connecting small manufacturers in Millbrook Heights with international suppliers. For 35 years, it was their whole world, their social life, their source of pride, their plan for retirement, and their legacy for the next generation. Mom handled the administrative side, while Dad focused on client relationships and logistics coordination. They're good people, don't get me wrong. They worked hard, treated their employees fairly, and genuinely believed they were building something meaningful for their children. But there are also people who never quite understood that the business world they started in doesn't exist anymore. They still think success comes from handshake deals and personal relationships, while the reality is that modern commerce runs on data analytics, risk assessment, and financial optimization. That disconnect between their worldview and business reality is exactly what created the opportunity I've been exploiting for the past 3 years. See, when I graduated from Riverside University in 2019, I had 2 job offers on the table. One was an entry-level position at Henderson & Associates, a small accounting firm here in Millbrook Heights where I could work on local business accounts and slowly build a modest practice. The other was a position with Blackstone Financial Group in Chicago, where I'd be part of a team that handled multi-million-dollar corporate restructuring deals. My parents assumed I'd take the local job. They thought I'd want to stay close to home, maybe eventually help out with Clearwater Maritime's books, and settle into the kind of comfortable, predictable life they'd built for themselves. Nathaniel actually told me at my graduation party that he was, quote, glad I'd found something that suited my personality, and that he looked forward to having me handle the family business's accounting once he took over. I took the Chicago job. For 2 years, I worked 100-hour weeks learning everything I could about how sophisticated investors analyze troubled companies. I learned how to structure complex financial instruments, how to identify undervalued assets, and how to navigate the legal frameworks that govern creditor rights. Most importantly, I learned how to think like someone who treats business as business, not as an extension of personal relationships. But I also kept watching Clearwater Maritime from a distance. I subscribed to industry publications, monitored their customer reviews online, and occasionally drove past their facility when I was home for holidays. What I saw wasn't encouraging. The shipping industry was changing rapidly, with new technologies and global supply chain disruptions, creating challenges that required substantial capital investments and strategic pivoting. Meanwhile, my family was operating like it was still 1995. That's when I realized I had a choice to make. I could continue building my career in Chicago and watch my family's business slowly collapse from afar, or I could find a way to position myself to actually help them when the inevitable crisis arrived. The problem was, I knew that any direct offer of assistance would be rejected. They'd see it as criticism of Nathaniel's leadership or an attack on Dad's legacy. So I decided to help them indirectly in a way that would give me the leverage to actually make a difference when the time came. I started building a network of investment vehicles that could provide the capital Clearwater Maritime would eventually need, structured in a way that protected both my financial interests and gave me the authority to implement the changes that would actually save the company. I never intended for it to become adversarial. I always hoped that Nathaniel would prove me wrong, that he'd find a way to adapt the business to modern realities, and that my contingency plans would never be necessary. But hope doesn't pay the bills, and good intentions don't prevent bankruptcy. Now, 3 years later, I'm sitting in my apartment in downtown Millbrook Heights. I moved back 2 years ago when it became clear that the situation was heading toward a crisis, looking at financial documents that tell a story my family doesn't want to acknowledge. Tomorrow's meeting isn't going to be a pleasant family conversation about finding new investors. It's going to be a reckoning where I have to decide whether I'm Elena the daughter and sister, or Elena the creditor who holds the power to determine whether Clearwater Maritime Solutions continues to exist. And honestly, I'm not sure which version of myself is going to show up to that meeting. To understand how we got to this point, you need to know about Clearwater Maritime Solutions and what it represented to my family. Picture this: a 40,000 square foot warehouse complex sitting on 12 acres of prime industrial real estate in the Port District of Millbrook Heights, surrounded by shipping containers stacked like giant metal building blocks, with the constant hum of forklifts and the smell of diesel fuel hanging in the air like industrial perfume. Dad bought that property in 1987 for $180,000, money he borrowed against our family home and every favor he could call in from relatives who believed in his vision. Back then, the Port District was considered the wrong side of town, a collection of abandoned lots and struggling businesses that nobody else wanted to touch. But Dad saw something different. He saw proximity to the interstate highway system, access to the regional freight rail network, and enough space to grow a business that could connect local manufacturers with global supply chains. The company started with Dad driving a rented truck to pick up shipping containers from the port of Galveston, 3 hours south of Millbrook Heights. He'd inspect the contents, handle the customs documentation, and deliver goods to small manufacturing companies throughout East Texas, who needed imported raw materials but didn't have the volume or expertise to deal with international shipping directly. It was basically a middleman operation, but Dad had a gift for building relationships and solving logistical problems that bigger companies couldn't be bothered with. Mom joined the business full-time in 1990 when I was 2 years old and Nathaniel was 4. She handled invoicing, customer service, and regulatory compliance, while Dad focused on expanding their network of overseas suppliers and domestic clients. By 1995, they had 8 full-time employees, a fleet of 6 delivery trucks, and contracts with manufacturers across 3 states. The business was generating enough revenue to pay off the property mortgage, support our family comfortably, and even start building a modest retirement fund. Those were the golden years, and honestly, they were pretty golden for our family too. We lived in a 4-bedroom house in Sunnyside Estates, the kind of neighborhood where kids rode their bikes until the streetlights came on and parents knew each other's names. Nathaniel and I went to private school at Millbrook Academy, played sports, took music lessons, and generally lived the suburban dream that my parents had worked so hard to create. But more than that, Clearwater Maritime gave our family an identity. We weren't just the Vasquez family. We were the Vasquez family that built something important, something that mattered to the local economy. Dad served on the Chamber of Commerce board. Mom organized charity drives for the local food bank. Our company sponsored Little League teams and high school scholarships. We were embedded in the community in a way that felt permanent and meaningful. The business model was actually pretty brilliant for its time. Small manufacturers needed reliable access to imported materials, specialty metals, precision components, industrial chemicals, but they didn't have the expertise or volume to establish direct relationships with overseas suppliers. Clearwater Maritime filled that gap by aggregating demand, managing international logistics, and providing local warehousing and distribution services. We were like a one-stop shop for companies that needed global supply chain access, but wanted to deal with someone they could trust just down the road. Dad's reputation in the industry was built on reliability and personal service. He knew his clients' production schedules, understood their cash flow cycles, and could expedite urgent orders or provide flexible payment terms when they needed help. He spoke fluent Spanish, which gave him advantages in negotiating with suppliers in Mexico and Central America. He understood the regulatory requirements for importing different types of materials, and had relationships with customs brokers who could navigate complex documentation requirements. The warehouse complex itself became a hub of activity that reflected Dad's vision for how international commerce should work. The main building housed administrative offices, customer service desks, and a sophisticated inventory management system that tracked thousands of different products across multiple climate-controlled storage zones. Outside, the container yard was organized with military precision. Incoming shipments in one section, outgoing orders in another, and long-term storage arranged by client and product type. What made Clearwater Maritime special wasn't just the logistics capabilities. It was the relationships. Dad knew his clients' businesses almost as well as they did. He'd visit their facilities, understand their production processes, and anticipate their needs before they even placed orders. Mom knew their wives' names, their kids' birthdays, and their company's payment preferences. We weren't just a vendor. We were partners in their success. That model worked beautifully through the 1990s and early 2000s. The North American Free Trade Agreement opened up new opportunities with Mexican suppliers. The growth of e-commerce created demand for faster, more flexible logistics services. Regional manufacturing was booming, and companies needed the kind of specialized import services that Clearwater Maritime provided. But around 2008, things started changing in ways that my parents didn't fully recognize at the time. The global financial crisis disrupted traditional supply chains and forced manufacturers to become more cost-conscious about their logistics spending. Chinese manufacturing was becoming more competitive, which meant suppliers that Dad had worked with for years were losing business to cheaper alternatives. Digital platforms were emerging that allowed companies to connect directly with overseas suppliers, reducing the need for intermediary services. Most importantly, the economics of international shipping were shifting toward larger, more standardized operations that could achieve economies of scale that smaller regional companies couldn't match. Where Dad had once competed on personal service and local expertise, the market was increasingly rewarding companies that could offer lower prices through technological automation and operational efficiency. By 2010, Clearwater Maritime was still profitable, but the growth had stopped. By 2015, revenues were actually declining as long-term clients either went out of business or found cheaper alternatives. Dad responded by working harder, longer hours, more client visits, aggressive pricing to retain accounts. But he wasn't addressing the fundamental changes in how the industry operated. The physical infrastructure that had been an asset in the 1990s was becoming a liability by 2015. The warehouse complex required constant maintenance, property taxes kept increasing, and the equipment was aging faster than Dad could afford to replace it. The regulatory environment was becoming more complex, requiring specialized software systems and compliance expertise that exceeded what Mom could handle as a part-time administrator. Meanwhile, Nathaniel was finishing his MBA program at State University and preparing to join the company full-time. Dad saw this as the solution to all their challenges: fresh ideas, modern business education, and youthful energy that could revitalize the company and position it for future growth. Mom was excited about the prospect of gradually stepping back from day-to-day operations and enjoying a semi-retirement supported by a thriving family business. They genuinely believed that passing the company to Nathaniel would solve their problems. They thought that his business school training would provide the strategic insight they needed to adapt to changing market conditions. They assumed that his youth and enthusiasm would attract new clients and create new opportunities for growth. What they didn't realize, what I could see clearly from my position outside the family bubble, was that Clearwater Maritime's problems weren't management problems that could be solved with better leadership. They were structural problems that required fundamental changes to the business model, significant capital investments, and potentially painful decisions about which parts of the operation were worth preserving. But by 2018, when Dad officially announced his intention to retire and hand over control to Nathaniel, it was too late for gradual adjustments. The company needed either a complete reinvention or a graceful exit strategy that would preserve as much value as possible for the family's retirement and Nathaniel's future. Instead, they chose to believe that love, hard work, and good intentions would be enough to overcome economic reality. And that's where my story really begins. Growing up in the Vasquez household was like living in a carefully choreographed play where everyone knew their role except me. There was Nathaniel, the crown prince who could do no wrong, my parents who worshipped the ground he walked on, and then there was me, the supporting character whose job was to smile, nod, and make everyone else look good by comparison. Let me tell you about my brother first, because understanding Nathaniel is crucial to understanding how we ended up in this mess. He's 33 now, 2 years older than me, and he's spent his entire life being told he was destined for greatness. Picture a guy who's genuinely handsome in that clean-cut, all-American way, 6 feet tall, athletic build from playing varsity tennis in high school, perfectly styled brown hair that never seems to get messed up, even when he's working in the warehouse. He has this confident smile that makes people want to trust him, and a firm handshake that Dad taught him was the foundation of every good business relationship. But here's the thing about Nathaniel. He's never had to develop real problem-solving skills, because problems have always been solved for him. When he struggled with calculus in high school, Dad hired a private tutor. When he couldn't decide on a college major, Mom researched business programs and filled out his applications. When he needed internships to build his resume, Dad called in favors with clients who gave him positions he hadn't really earned. His whole life has been a series of soft landings and second chances, which means he's never learned how to handle genuine adversity. Don't get me wrong, Nathaniel isn't malicious or intentionally selfish. He is actually a pretty likable guy who genuinely believes he cares about people and wants to do the right thing. The problem is that he's been so insulated from consequences that he doesn't understand the difference between good intentions and effective actions. He thinks being charming is the same as being competent, and he confuses confidence with expertise. In college, he majored in business administration with a focus on entrepreneurship, maintaining a solid B+ average while spending most of his time networking at fraternity parties and business club events. He did internships at 2 different logistics companies during summers, where he focused on client relations and sales support, rather than learning the operational details that actually make businesses run. His senior capstone project was a business plan for expanding Clearwater Maritime into e-commerce fulfillment services, an idea that sounded innovative but completely ignored the capital requirements and technical infrastructure that would be necessary to compete in that market. After graduation, Dad brought him into the company as operations manager, a title that sounded impressive but mostly involved shadowing existing employees and learning how the business actually worked. For 2 years, Nathaniel rotated through different departments: warehouse management, customer service, accounts receivable, supplier relations, while Dad gradually transitioned his own responsibilities to prepare for retirement. The problem was that during those 2 years, Dad was teaching Nathaniel how to maintain the existing business rather than how to transform it for changing market conditions. Nathaniel learned how to process orders, manage inventory, and maintain client relationships. But he never learned how to analyze financial statements, evaluate strategic alternatives, or make the kind of hard decisions that struggling businesses require. He was being trained to be a caretaker of a legacy rather than a leader of a competitive enterprise. Now let's talk about my parents, because their dynamic is what created this whole situation in the first place. Dad, Victor Vasquez, is 62 years old and represents everything that was admirable about the previous generation of business owners. He's hardworking, honest, and genuinely cares about his employees and clients. He built Clearwater Maritime through personal relationships, handshake deals, and an old-school work ethic that prioritized reliability over profitability. He's the kind of man who remembers his clients' children's names and sends flowers when their relatives pass away. But Dad is also stubborn, emotionally attached to outdated business practices, and completely unable to separate his personal identity from the company's success. To him, Clearwater Maritime isn't just a business. It's proof that a Mexican immigrant son could achieve the American dream through hard work and determination. It's his legacy, his contribution to the community, and his gift to the next generation. The idea that it might need to be fundamentally restructured or even sold feels like a personal failure that threatens everything he's worked for. Mom, Carmen Vasquez, is 59 and has always been the emotional center of our family. She's the one who remembers birthdays, organizes holiday gatherings, and tries to keep everyone happy and connected. In the business, she handled administrative tasks with meticulous attention to detail, but she never developed expertise in finance, strategy, or operations management. Her role was to support Dad's vision rather than contribute independent business insights. What makes Mom particularly influential in our family dynamics is her ability to frame every situation in terms of family loyalty and emotional obligation. When conflicts arise, she doesn't address the substantive issues. Instead, she talks about how important it is for family members to support each other and preserve the relationships that matter most. She's the one who turns business disagreements into personal betrayals and strategic decisions into tests of love and commitment. The family hierarchy was established early and never questioned. Dad was the visionary leader whose judgment was final. Mom was the supportive partner who implemented his decisions and maintained family harmony. Nathaniel was the chosen successor who would carry forward Dad's legacy. And I was the dutiful daughter whose role was to be proud of everyone else's accomplishments and contribute to the family's success in whatever way was needed. This dynamic shaped every interaction we had growing up. At dinner table conversations, Dad would ask Nathaniel about his classes, his friends, and his plans for the future, while my achievements were acknowledged with polite interest before the conversation moved back to more important topics. When we had family meetings about business decisions, Nathaniel's opinions were solicited and seriously considered, while my questions were treated as signs that I didn't understand how things worked. The most telling example happened when I was 16 and Nathaniel was 18. Dad was considering whether to invest in new warehouse management software that would automate inventory tracking and reduce labor costs. During a family discussion about the decision, I suggested that he should also consider how the software might generate data that could help identify trends in customer ordering patterns and seasonal demand fluctuations. Dad looked at me with this surprised expression like he couldn't quite believe I'd had a business-related thought, and said, "That's a very good point, Elena. You're definitely your father's daughter." Then he turned to Nathaniel and said, "What do you think about Elena's idea? Could something like that help us serve our customers better?" The message was clear. My ideas had value only when they were filtered through Nathaniel's perspective and validated by his approval. I wasn't being invited to participate in business discussions as an independent thinker. I was being allowed to contribute supporting commentary that might help Nathaniel develop his own insights. This pattern continued through high school and college. When I excelled in advanced mathematics and economics courses, my parents were proud but not particularly interested in how those skills might apply to business challenges. When I won academic scholarships and graduated summa cum laude, they celebrated appropriately, but never suggested that my analytical abilities might be valuable for Clearwater Maritime's future. Meanwhile, every aspect of Nathaniel's education and career development was viewed through the lens of how it would prepare him to lead the family business. His business courses were discussed extensively at family dinners. His internship experiences were analyzed for lessons that could be applied to improve company operations. His networking activities were encouraged because they might generate future business opportunities. By the time I graduated from college and moved to Chicago, the family narrative was firmly established. Nathaniel was the future of Clearwater Maritime. Dad was the wise founder who would guide the transition. Mom was the supportive matriarch who would ensure family harmony. And I was the successful daughter who had found her own path and would remain a loving but peripheral part of the family business story. What none of them realized was that my peripheral position had given me something they all lacked: objectivity. While they were emotionally invested in preserving relationships and maintaining traditions, I was developing the analytical skills and industry knowledge that would eventually allow me to see solutions they couldn't imagine. And now, 3 years after Nathaniel officially took control of the company, those family roles are about to be dramatically redefined. Tomorrow's meeting will reveal that the dutiful daughter has become the power broker, the chosen successor has become the struggling debtor, and the wise founder has become a man whose legacy depends on his previously overlooked child's willingness to save it. The moment that changed everything happened on a Tuesday in March 2021, during what was supposed to be a routine family dinner at my parents' house. I remember the date exactly because it was the same day I received confirmation that my investment group had successfully acquired a portfolio of distressed commercial loans from First National Bank of Millbrook Heights. What I didn't know at the time was that one of those loans belonged to Clearwater Maritime Solutions. The dinner invitation had come from Mom 3 days earlier, framed as a family celebration to mark the 2nd anniversary of Nathaniel officially taking over the company. "We want to acknowledge how well he's doing," she'd said over the phone, "and maybe discuss some exciting expansion opportunities he's been working on." The way she emphasized exciting should have been my first clue that something was off, but I was distracted by my own professional obligations and didn't think much about it. I drove over to their house in Sunnyside Estates that evening, expecting the usual routine: Mom's famous enchiladas, Dad's stories about the early days of the business, and Nathaniel's enthusiastic updates about client meetings and operational improvements. The house looked exactly the same as it had throughout my childhood: manicured lawn, flower beds arranged with mathematical precision, and Mom's collection of ceramic garden gnomes that she insisted were whimsical rather than tacky. When I walked into the dining room, though, I could immediately sense tension that had nothing to do with celebration. Dad was sitting at the head of the table looking older than his 62 years, with stress lines around his eyes that I hadn't noticed during our last family gathering. Mom was bustling around the kitchen with nervous energy, talking too much and too fast about how proud she was of everything Nathaniel has accomplished. And Nathaniel himself was sitting there with a forced smile, looking like someone who was trying very hard to appear confident about something he wasn't confident about at all. The conversation during dinner was awkward in that specific way that happens when everyone is avoiding the topic they're actually there to discuss. Dad asked about my work in Chicago, but I could tell he wasn't really listening to my answers. Mom kept bringing up memories from when Nathaniel and I were kids, as if she was trying to remind us all of happier times when problems were simpler. Nathaniel contributed to the conversation, but he seemed distracted, checking his phone more often than usual and occasionally exchanging glances with Dad that suggested they were having some kind of silent communication. It wasn't until we finished eating and Mom brought out coffee and dessert that Dad finally cleared his throat in that familiar way that meant he was about to make an important announcement. "Elena," he said, "we wanted to talk to you tonight because we have some news about the company, and we'd like your perspective on something." That phrasing immediately put me on alert. In our family, "we'd like your perspective" usually meant, "we've already made a decision and we want you to validate it," not, "we're genuinely seeking your input." But I played along, leaning back in my chair and adopting the interested but not too involved expression that had served me well during previous family business discussions. "Nathaniel has been doing incredible work over the past 2 years," Dad continued, beaming with pride. "Our client retention rate is at 93%. We've expanded our service offerings to include expedited shipping options, and we've even started exploring opportunities in the e-commerce fulfillment market. The future of Clearwater Maritime has never looked brighter." I nodded politely, but something about his tone didn't match the content of what he was saying. When people talk about genuine success, they sound confident and relaxed. Dad sounded like he was trying to convince himself as much as he was trying to convince me. "That's wonderful," I said. "You must be very proud of what you've built together." "We are," Mom jumped in quickly. "But you know how business is. There are always new challenges and opportunities that require careful consideration. That's actually why we wanted to talk to you tonight." Here it comes, I thought. Whatever they're really here to discuss. Nathaniel finally spoke up, and his voice had a quality I'd never heard before. A combination of defensiveness and desperation that immediately raised red flags in my analytical mind. "The thing is, Elena, we've been presented with some amazing opportunities for expansion that could really take Clearwater Maritime to the next level. But they require significant capital investment, and we want to make sure we're approaching the financing correctly." "What kind of opportunities?" I asked, genuinely curious now. "Well," Dad said, launching into what sounded like a well-rehearsed explanation, "there's a chance for us to acquire the operations of Coastal Logistics Services, a company that handles container shipping for the entire Gulf Coast region. Their owner is retiring, and he's specifically reached out to us because he knows our reputation in the industry. If we could acquire their client base and operational infrastructure, we'd basically triple our revenue overnight." I felt my stomach drop, because I knew exactly what he was talking about. Coastal Logistics Services wasn't being sold because the owner was retiring. It was being liquidated because the company had defaulted on $4.2 million in secured debt and was facing bankruptcy proceedings. The opportunity Dad was describing was actually a distressed asset sale, where creditors were trying to recover whatever value they could from a failed business. "That sounds like a significant undertaking," I said carefully. "What kind of capital investment are we talking about?" "About $2.8 million, Nathaniel said, and I could hear the strain in his voice, "which is more than we have available in our current cash flow, obviously. So we've been exploring financing options that would allow us to move forward with the acquisition while maintaining our operational flexibility." Translation: they needed to borrow money they couldn't afford to buy assets from a company that had failed for reasons they probably didn't understand. "Have you done due diligence on Coastal Logistics?" I asked. "Financial analysis, operational assessment, market research to understand why they're selling?" The brief silence that followed my question told me everything I needed to know. They hadn't done due diligence because they didn't know how to do due diligence. They were treating this like an opportunity because someone had presented it to them as an opportunity, not because they had independently verified that it made business sense. "We've reviewed their revenue figures," Dad said defensively. "Their annual gross receipts for the past 3 years have averaged $6.2 million. Even if we only retained half of their client base, that would represent a massive increase in our business volume." "What about their expenses?" I pressed. "Debt obligations, operational costs, regulatory compliance issues, facility maintenance requirements, employee contracts." More silence. "Look," Nathaniel said, his voice getting tighter, "we're not asking you to evaluate the business opportunity for us. We're capable of making our own strategic decisions. What we wanted to discuss with you was whether you might be interested in participating in the financing as a family investment." And there it was. The real reason for this dinner. The real purpose behind all the talk about celebration and expansion opportunities. They wanted me to lend them money for a deal that I could already tell was going to destroy them. "How much are you looking to borrow?" I asked. "Well," Mom said, jumping into the conversation with her trademark diplomatic approach, "we were thinking that since you're doing so well in Chicago, And since this is a family business that will benefit everyone in the long run, maybe you'd be willing to contribute $500,000 as a bridge loan until we can secure conventional financing. $500,000. They were asking me to hand over $500,000 so they could buy a failed company's assets without doing basic research to understand why that company had failed in the first place. I looked around the table at my family, Dad with his earnest hope, Mom with her nervous optimism, and Nathaniel with his barely concealed desperation, and I realized that this moment was going to define our relationships for the rest of our lives. I could say yes and watch them lose my money, along with everything else they were about to risk. I could say no and become the family member who didn't support them when they needed help. Or I could find a third option that none of us had considered yet. Let me think about it, I said finally. This is obviously a big decision, and I want to make sure I understand all the implications before I commit to anything. Of course, Dad said, looking relieved that I hadn't rejected the idea outright. Take all the time you need. We're not planning to move forward for another few weeks anyway. But as I drove home that night, I wasn't thinking about whether to lend them money. I was thinking about how to position myself to save them from themselves when this inevitably went wrong, because it was going to go wrong spectacularly, catastrophically, and probably sooner than any of them imagined. There's something else you need to understand, I said finally. Option 2 isn't just about financial restructuring. It's about transforming Clearwater Maritime into a completely different kind of company. We're going to eliminate services that aren't profitable, even if they're services that Dad pioneered. We're going to automate processes that currently require manual labor, which means some longtime employees are going to lose their jobs. And we're going to prioritize efficiency and competitiveness over personal relationships and community connections. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of everything they were giving up in order to save what could be saved. We understand, Dad said quietly, and we're ready to make those changes, as long as you're willing to help us through the transition. As I drove home that night, I realized that I had gotten everything I had been working toward for the past 3 years. I had the authority to save Clearwater Maritime, the family's respect for my expertise, and the opportunity to prove that my vision for the company's future was worth the pain of getting there. But I also realized that success was going to feel very different from what I had imagined when this all began. The transformation of Clearwater Maritime Solutions from a failing family business into a profitable logistics operation took 18 months and felt like performing surgery on a patient who was awake and watching every incision. Every decision I made affected people I had known my entire life. Every operational change eliminated traditions that my family had spent decades building, and every improvement came at the cost of something that had once made the company feel like home. The first 6 months were the most brutal. I moved back to Millbrook Heights permanently and took over the day-to-day operations, while Nathaniel transitioned into a sales and client relations role that matched his strengths without exposing the company to his weaknesses in financial management. Dad remained as an advisor and ceremonial president, but his actual decision-making authority was limited to employee relations and community outreach activities. Mom stepped back entirely from business operations, focusing instead on managing the family's personal finances and supporting Dad through what was essentially a forced retirement from meaningful involvement in his life's work. The operational changes were as painful as I had predicted. We eliminated the specialty importing services that had been Dad's pride and joy, but generated less than 8% of our revenue while consuming 23% of our operational resources. We automated the inventory management system, which eliminated 4 full-time positions and forced us to lay off employees who had worked for the company for over a decade. We canceled the equipment leases that were draining our cash flow and switched to a model where we rented specialized machinery only when specific contracts required it. Most difficult of all, we sold the original warehouse complex that Dad had bought in 1987 and moved to a smaller, more efficient facility in the industrial park outside town. The new building had better technology infrastructure and lower operational costs, but it lacked the character and history that had made Clearwater Maritime feel like a family legacy rather than just another business. The human cost of these changes was something I had anticipated intellectually but wasn't prepared for emotionally. Maria Santos, who had managed our customer service department for 15 years, broke down crying when I told her that her position was being eliminated in favor of an automated phone system and email-based support. Tommy Rodriguez, who had operated our forklift equipment since 1998, shook his head in disappointment when I explained that we were outsourcing our warehouse operations to a third-party logistics provider. But the hardest conversation was with Dad, 3 months into the restructuring process, when he asked me if I thought we were destroying everything good about the company in order to save the parts that could generate profit. "Elena," he said, sitting in my new office that occupied a quarter of the space his old office had commanded, "I know these changes are necessary, and I know you're doing what needs to be done. But sometimes, I drive past the old building, and I think about all the people we used to employ, all the relationships we used to maintain, all the ways we used to contribute to this community, and I wonder if what we're building now is worth what we had to tear down to get here."
Translation: he was planning to use high-interest, short-term loans to fund the purchase, hoping that the acquired business would generate enough immediate cash flow to qualify for better financing terms later. It was exactly the kind of desperate financial maneuvering that turns manageable problems into existential crises. I spent the next 72 hours making phone calls, reviewing legal documents, and mapping out the financial relationships that were about to destroy my family's legacy. What I discovered was that Nathaniel had already borrowed $1.3 million from 3 different lenders to fund the coastal logistics acquisition, with loan terms that would require monthly payments of $47,000 starting in May. Combined with Clearwater Maritime's existing debt obligations, the company would need to generate over $2.1 million in annual profit just to service their debt, more than twice what they had ever achieved in their best year. But the worst part was yet to come. On April 12th, 3 days before the scheduled closing, the primary lender for the coastal logistics deal withdrew their commitment due to, quote, changed financial circumstances. Nathaniel was faced with a choice: forfeit the $200,000 earnest money deposit he'd already paid, or find alternative financing within 72 hours to complete a transaction that was going to destroy the company anyway. He chose to find alternative financing. Over the next 3 days, I watched my brother make phone calls to every lender, investor, and financial institution he could find, desperately trying to piece together $2.8 million in funding before the deadline. He contacted hard money lenders who charged 24% annual interest. He reached out to equipment financing companies who required personal guarantees from Dad. He even explored factoring arrangements where they would sell their accounts receivable at massive discounts just to generate immediate cash flow. By April 14th, he had cobbled together enough funding to close the deal, but the terms were catastrophic. The financing package included a $1.8 million loan from Meridian Capital Group at 15% annual interest, a $600,000 equipment lease with personal guarantees from both Nathaniel and Dad, and a $400,000 line of credit secured by the company's real estate. The combined monthly payments would be $73,000, which was more than Clearwater Maritime's average monthly revenue. What Nathaniel didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that Meridian Capital Group was one of the investment vehicles I had established specifically to provide financing for situations like this. Through a complex web of LLC structures and subsidiary relationships, I had positioned myself to be the lender of last resort for businesses in distress, including my own family's company. The closing took place on April 15th in a conference room at Henderson & Associates, the same law firm where Dad had incorporated Clearwater Maritime 34 years earlier. I wasn't present, but I received detailed reports from the closing attorney about how the transaction unfolded. Nathaniel arrived looking exhausted and stressed, accompanied by Dad, who kept asking questions about technical details that he didn't really understand. The seller's representatives were clearly eager to complete the deal and transfer liability for coastal logistics problems to someone else. The signing took 3 hours, during which Nathaniel executed personal guarantees that put his house at risk. Dad pledged the company's real estate as collateral, and both of them committed to debt service obligations that would consume every dollar of profit the combined companies could possibly generate. When it was over, Nathaniel owned a logistics operation that was twice as large as what he'd started with, and approximately 4 times as likely to fail within the next 12 months. He had transformed a manageable family business with modest profitability into a complex commercial enterprise, with crushing debt obligations and operational challenges that exceeded his experience and capabilities. The first sign of trouble came exactly 18 days after the closing, when Clearwater Maritime missed its first monthly payment to Meridian Capital Group. The second sign came 6 days later, when their primary insurance carrier canceled their coverage due to non-payment of premiums. The third sign came 2 weeks after that, when their largest client, a manufacturer who accounted for 38% of their revenue, terminated their contract due to service disruptions caused by the operational integration challenges.
By the end of May, just 6 weeks after the Coastal Logistics acquisition, Clearwater Maritime was in default on multiple loan agreements, facing potential foreclosure on their real estate and generating negative cash flow of approximately $31,000 per month. The expanded operation that was supposed to save the company was actually accelerating its destruction, creating new problems faster than Nathaniel could solve the existing ones. And through it all, I was watching from my position as a hidden creditor, receiving monthly reports about payment delays, operational difficulties, and declining performance metrics. Every missed payment, every covenant violation, and every sign of distress was being documented in files that would eventually give me the legal authority to intervene in ways that my family couldn't imagine. The irony was perfect. By trying to save the company through aggressive expansion, Nathaniel had inadvertently given me the leverage I needed to actually save it through financial restructuring. His desperation had become my opportunity, and his mistakes were about to become my pathway to finally having a voice in decisions that affected our family's future. By September 2021, the situation had deteriorated to the point where even my parents couldn't ignore the signs that something was seriously wrong. The phone calls started coming more frequently, first from Mom, asking casual questions about how my work was going and whether I might be able to visit home more often. Then from Dad, making awkward attempts to discuss general business concepts and whether I'd ever dealt with temporary cash flow challenges in my professional experience. Finally, from Nathaniel himself, usually late at night when he'd been drinking, and his usual confidence had evaporated into raw desperation. The most telling conversation happened on a Thursday evening in early October when Nathaniel called me at 11:30 p.m., clearly having had several drinks and struggling to maintain the facade that everything was under control. "Elena," he said, his voice slurring slightly, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. In your work with those corporate restructuring companies, have you ever seen situations where good businesses just hit a rough patch and need some time to stabilize?" I could hear the hope in his voice, the desperate need for me to tell him that what was happening to Clearwater Maritime was normal and temporary, rather than the structural collapse that we both knew it actually was. "What kind of rough patch are we talking about?" I asked gently. "Just, cash flow timing issues. Maybe some clients being slower to pay than usual, or equipment costs being higher than projected. The kind of stuff that works itself out once you get through the adjustment period." The adjustment period he was referring to had lasted 7 months and was getting worse every week. Clearwater Maritime was now 3 months behind on their loan payments to Meridian Capital Group, 4 months behind on their equipment leases, and had received foreclosure notices from 2 different creditors. They had laid off 6 of their 12 employees and were operating with minimal insurance coverage because they couldn't afford to pay their premiums. The rough patch was actually a death spiral that would end in bankruptcy within 6 months if nothing changed. "Nathaniel," I said carefully, "sometimes what looks like a temporary cash flow problem is actually a sign of deeper issues that need to be addressed systematically. Have you considered bringing in outside expertise to help evaluate your options?" The silence on the other end of the line lasted so long that I thought he might have hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I think I might have screwed up really badly, Elena. I think I might have destroyed everything Dad built." That conversation kept me awake for the rest of the night, not because I was surprised by what Nathaniel had told me, but because I realized that the moment of reckoning was approaching faster than I had anticipated. As the holder of Clearwater Maritime's largest debt obligation, I had the legal right to demand immediate repayment or initiate foreclosure proceedings at any time. I also had the financial resources and industry expertise to restructure the company in ways that could actually save it. But exercising those rights would require revealing my position as their primary creditor, which would fundamentally alter every relationship in our family. The decision to move forward came 10 days later when I received a formal notice from Meridian Capital Group's legal department informing me that Clearwater Maritime had missed their fourth consecutive monthly payment and was now in material default under the terms of their loan agreement. According to the contract Nathaniel had signed, I could demand immediate repayment of the entire $1.8 million principal balance plus accrued interest and penalties, or I could begin foreclosure proceedings to recover my investment through asset liquidation. Instead of taking either of those actions, I decided to offer my family something they couldn't get anywhere else, a chance to save the company through voluntary restructuring before external creditors forced them into bankruptcy. But I also decided that this offer would come with complete transparency about my financial position and non-negotiable terms that would give me operational control over the restructuring process. I spent the next 2 weeks preparing for what I knew would be the most difficult conversation of my life. I had my attorney draft a comprehensive proposal that outlined 3 possible paths forward: voluntary liquidation with maximum asset recovery for the family, debt restructuring with new management oversight, or a complete business transformation under my operational control. I compiled detailed financial analyses, showing exactly how much money the company was losing each month and projecting when bankruptcy would become inevitable under current management. Most importantly, I prepared myself emotionally for the reality that this conversation would either repair our family relationships by establishing a foundation of honesty and mutual respect, or it would destroy them by revealing just how much resentment and mistrust had built up over the years of being overlooked and undervalued. The call I made to Dad on October 28th was one of the hardest phone calls I've ever had to make. "Dad," I said, "I think it's time for us to have a family meeting about Clearwater Maritime's financial situation. There are some things you need to know, and some decisions that need to be made before it's too late to preserve anything of value." The silence that followed my statement lasted nearly 30 seconds. When Dad finally responded, his voice had a quality I'd never heard before: part resignation, part relief, and part fear of what he was about to learn. "How much do you know about our situation?" he asked quietly. "I know more than you think I do," I said, "and I know more than Nathaniel has been telling you. The question is whether you're ready to hear the truth and consider some alternatives that might save the company." We agreed to meet at the Clearwater Maritime offices the following Saturday at 2 p.m. Dad would bring Mom and Nathaniel, and I would bring the financial documentation and legal proposals that would give them a complete picture of their options. What I didn't tell him was that I would also be bringing the loan agreements, payment records, and default notices that would reveal my position as their largest creditor. The days leading up to that meeting were surreal. I went through the motions of my normal routine: reviewing client files, attending conference calls, managing my investment portfolio, while knowing that everything was about to change. I had spent 3 years positioning myself to have this conversation, but now that it was actually happening, I felt a mixture of anticipation and dread that made it difficult to concentrate on anything else. On Friday evening, the day before our scheduled meeting, Mom called me with what she clearly thought was good news. "Elena, honey, I just wanted to let you know that we've been talking as a family, and we've decided to ask if you'd be willing to help us explore some financing options for the company. We know you have connections in the financial world, and we thought maybe you could help us find the right kind of investors or lenders who understand our situation." The irony was almost too perfect to believe. After 3 years of struggling with problems they couldn't solve, they were finally ready to ask for my help, not knowing that I was already more involved in their situation than they could possibly imagine. They were planning to ask me to help them find investors, when I was actually their biggest investor. They were hoping I could connect them with understanding lenders, when I was already their most important lender. "I'll definitely help however I can," I told Mom. "In fact, I think tomorrow's meeting is going to be very productive. I have some ideas that might surprise you." That night, I laid out the documents I would be presenting in neat stacks on my dining room table. Financial statements showing Clearwater Maritime's deteriorating condition, market analyses explaining why their current business model was unsustainable, restructuring proposals outlining potential paths forward, and finally, the loan agreements and payment records that would reveal my true relationship to their company. Looking at those documents, I realized that tomorrow's meeting would be the culmination of everything I'd been working toward since that awkward family dinner 18 months earlier. For the first time in my adult life, I would be sitting at a table where my opinion mattered more than anyone else's, where my expertise was not just valuable but essential, and where my decisions would determine the future of something that had defined our family for over 3 decades. The overlooked daughter was about to become the most important person in the room, and I wasn't sure any of us were prepared for how dramatically that was going to change everything. Saturday afternoon arrived with the kind of crisp October weather that makes everything feel more dramatic than it actually is. I drove to the Clearwater Maritime offices carrying a leather briefcase that contained enough documentation to either save my family's business or destroy our relationships forever. The parking lot was empty except for Dad's pickup truck and Nathaniel's sedan, and the building looked smaller and more tired than I remembered from my childhood visits. When I walked into the conference room, the atmosphere was thick with nervous tension. Dad was sitting at the head of the table wearing his best dress shirt, and the expression of a man who was trying to maintain dignity while his world collapsed around him. Mom had positioned herself next to him, her hands folded in her lap and her smile a little too bright to be genuine. Nathaniel was across from them, looking like he hadn't slept properly in weeks, with dark circles under his eyes and that particular kind of exhaustion that comes from months of fighting battles you can't win. "Elena," Dad said, standing up to give me a hug that felt more formal than usual. "Thank you for making time for this. We know you're busy with your own work, and we appreciate you being willing to help us think through some options." I set my briefcase on the table and took the seat directly across from Nathaniel, where I could see everyone's faces clearly. "Before we start," I said, "I want everyone to understand that what we're going to discuss today is going to be difficult, and it's going to require complete honesty from all of us. Are you prepared for that?" They all nodded, but I could see the wariness in their expressions. They were expecting me to deliver bad news about market conditions or financing challenges, not to fundamentally redefine our family dynamics. "Nathaniel," I began, opening my briefcase and removing the first stack of documents, "let's start with a clear picture of where Clearwater Maritime stands financially. According to the records I've reviewed, the company currently has total liabilities of $4.7 million against assets valued at approximately $2.1 million. Your monthly operating expenses are $127,000, while your average monthly revenue over the past 6 months has been $84,000. That means you're losing $43,000 every month with no realistic prospect of returning to profitability under your current business model." The silence that followed was deafening. Dad's face went pale, Mom's forced smile disappeared completely, and Nathaniel looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. "Those numbers can't be right," Dad said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm afraid they are," I replied, sliding copies of the financial analysis across the table. "And they're actually conservative estimates. The real situation is probably worse than what I've outlined here." Nathaniel finally found his voice, though it came out defensive and strained. "Elena, I know things have been challenging, but you're looking at this from the outside without understanding the full context. We've been dealing with some temporary setbacks, but we have plans in place to address the cash flow issues." "What plans?" I asked quietly. "We're exploring additional financing options," he said, glancing at Dad for support. "And we're implementing operational efficiencies that should reduce our monthly expenses by at least 15%. Plus, we have several potential new clients who could significantly increase our revenue base." I nodded sympathetically, then reached into my briefcase for the second stack of documents. "That brings us to the financing discussion," I said. "You mentioned that you're exploring additional financing options. Let me ask you something specific. Are you familiar with Meridian Capital Group?" Nathaniel's expression changed immediately, and I could see recognition and confusion warring in his face. "Yes," he said slowly. "They're the primary lender for the coastal logistics acquisition." "Why?" "Because," I said, placing the loan agreements on the table, "Meridian Capital Group is a wholly owned subsidiary of Delacroix Holdings, which is itself a subsidiary of Raven Financial Solutions. And Raven Financial Solutions is my company." The words hung in the air like a physical presence that nobody quite knew how to process. Dad's mouth actually fell open. Mom made a small gasping sound, and Nathaniel just stared at me with an expression that cycled through disbelief, comprehension, and something that might have been betrayal. "What are you saying?" Dad asked, his voice hollow. "I'm saying that I'm your largest creditor," I replied, maintaining eye contact with each of them in turn. "The $1.8 million loan that Nathaniel signed in April, that's my money. The monthly payments that you've been unable to make for the past 4 months, those payments were supposed to come to me. The default notices and foreclosure warnings that have been keeping you awake at night, I'm the one who has the legal authority to issue them." Nathaniel's face had gone from pale to red to something approaching purple. When he finally spoke, his voice was shaking with anger. "You've been spying on us? You've been secretly financing our business while pretending to be supportive?" "I've been positioning myself to help you," I said calmly, "because I could see that you were heading toward bankruptcy and I was the only person in this family with the expertise and resources to prevent that from happening." "Help us!" Nathaniel exploded, standing up so quickly that his chair rolled backward. "You call this helping? You manipulated us into borrowing money from you without telling us who we were dealing with." "I offered you financing on better terms than you could get anywhere else," I replied, my voice still steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. 15% annual interest when every other lender was quoting you 24% or higher. No personal guarantees required from mom or dad. Flexible payment terms that could be modified based on performance metrics. Those weren't standard commercial loan terms, Nathaniel. Those were family terms designed to give you the best possible chance of success. Dad had been sitting in stunned silence, but now he looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "How long have you been planning this?" "Since the dinner where you asked me to lend you $500,000 to buy Coastal Logistics," I said. "I knew that acquisition was going to destroy you, but I also knew that telling you not to do it wouldn't stop you. So I decided to make sure that when you needed help, I'd be in a position to actually provide it." "By lying to us," Mom said, her voice barely audible. "By protecting myself and preserving options," I corrected. "If I had offered to lend you money directly, would you have accepted it? Or would you have seen it as charity or criticism or proof that I didn't believe in Nathaniel's ability to run the company?" The question hung in the air because we all knew the answer. They would have rejected direct help from me, just like they had rejected my input on business decisions for my entire adult life. "So what happens now?" Nathaniel asked, slumping back into his chair with the defeated posture of someone who had finally accepted that he was completely out of options. I reached into my briefcase for the final set of documents, the restructuring proposals that represented months of careful planning and analysis. "Now we decide whether you want to save this company or just minimize the damage when it fails," I said. "I have 3 options to present to you, and you're going to need to choose one of them within the next 2 weeks. "And if we don't choose any of them?" Dad asked. "Then I exercise my rights as your primary creditor and begin foreclosure proceedings," I said. "Which means you lose everything anyway, except you'll also lose control over how it happens." I spread the 3 proposals across the table like a dealer laying out cards in a poker game where the stakes were our family's entire legacy. Option 1, voluntary liquidation, where we sell the assets in an orderly fashion and you walk away with enough money to retire comfortably. Option 2, debt restructuring, where I convert my loan to equity and we scale the business down to a sustainable size under new management. Option 3, complete business transformation, where I take operational control and we rebuild Clearwater Maritime from the ground up as a modern logistics company. I looked around the table at my family, all of them staring at documents that represented the end of everything they thought they knew about their lives and relationships. "The choice is yours," I said, "but it has to be a real choice made with complete information about what each option actually means. The days of wishful thinking and hoping for miracles are over." Nathaniel looked up at me with an expression that was equal parts hatred and grudging respect. "How long do we have to decide?" 2 weeks, I said. "And whatever you choose, we're going to do it as a family, with everyone understanding exactly what we're committing to and why." For the first time in my adult life, I was the most important person in the room, and the silence that followed my words was the sound of our family's power structure shifting permanently. The 2 weeks that followed that conference room revelation were the most emotionally turbulent of my entire life. What I had expected to be a period of careful deliberation and family discussions turned into an all-out war where every conversation became a battlefield, and every interaction was loaded with accusations, guilt trips, and desperate attempts to manipulate the situation. The first salvo came 12 hours after our meeting, when Nathaniel showed up at my apartment at 7:30 a.m. on Sunday morning, looking like he hadn't slept and carrying a coffee cup that I suspected contained more whiskey than caffeine. I opened the door to find him standing there with the kind of manic energy that comes from spending all night cycling between rage and desperation. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday," he announced, pushing past me into my living room without waiting for an invitation. "And I want to understand something. When exactly did you decide that I was going to fail? Was it when Dad first announced he was handing me the company? Was it during my first year when I was learning the operations? Or did you wait until I made the coastal logistics deal to start plotting against me?" I closed the door and turned to face him, recognizing that this conversation was going to set the tone for everything that followed. "I never decided you were going to fail, Nathaniel. I prepared for the possibility that you might need help, and I positioned myself to provide that help when the time came." "Bullshit," he said, his voice getting louder. "You've been waiting for me to screw up so you could swoop in and take over. You've been planning this hostile takeover since the day Dad chose me instead of you." "A hostile takeover?" I repeated, genuinely surprised by the accusation. "I offered you financing on terms that no commercial lender would have given you. I've been subsidizing your mistakes for 8 months while you figured out how to run the company. If I wanted to take over, I could have called in the loan after the first missed payment and forced you into bankruptcy proceedings. Instead, I gave you time and flexibility that I didn't have to provide." But Nathaniel wasn't listening to logical arguments. He was operating from a place of wounded pride and existential fear, which meant that every word I said was being filtered through his need to be the victim, rather than the beneficiary of my intervention. "You manipulated us," he continued, pacing around my living room like a caged animal. "You used your professional knowledge to take advantage of our desperation. That's not help. That's exploitation." "Then pay me back," I said quietly. "If you think my terms were exploitative, then find alternative financing and pay off the Meridian Capital loan. I'll gladly release all my claims on the company if you can demonstrate that you have access to better options." The silence that followed my challenge lasted nearly a minute because we both knew that he couldn't find alternative financing. No legitimate lender would touch Clearwater Maritime in its current condition, and no private investor would be willing to take on the risks that I had accepted as a family member. "That's not the point," he said finally, his voice quieter but no less angry. "The point is that you lied to us. You pretended to be supportive while secretly positioning yourself to control our lives." "I positioned myself to save your lives," I corrected, "because someone in this family needed to understand what was actually happening and take responsibility for protecting our future." That phrase, "take responsibility," hit him like a physical blow. I could see it in the way his shoulders sagged, and his expression shifted from anger to something closer to despair. "You think I haven't been taking responsibility?" he asked. "You think I haven't been killing myself trying to save this company?" "I think you've been working incredibly hard to avoid acknowledging that the company couldn't be saved using the methods you were comfortable with," I said gently. "And I think you've been so focused on proving that you could handle everything yourself that you missed opportunities to get help before the situation became critical." The conversation continued for another hour, covering the same ground repeatedly as Nathaniel tried to find some angle that would make me the villain in this story. But eventually, his energy ran out and he left my apartment looking more defeated than angry, with the promise that he would discuss my proposals with Mom and Dad before making any decisions. What I discovered over the next few days was that those family discussions were not going well. Mom called me on Tuesday afternoon, crying, to tell me that she felt like I had torn the family apart by keeping secrets and manipulating situations, instead of just talking to them directly. Dad called me on Wednesday evening to ask whether there was any way to work out a family solution that doesn't involve all these legal contracts and business formalities. But the most difficult conversation came on Friday, when all three of them showed up at my office without an appointment, clearly having planned some kind of coordinated intervention designed to pressure me into backing down from my ultimatum. "Elena," Dad began once they had settled into the chairs around my conference table, "we've been talking as a family about the situation with Clearwater Maritime, and we've come to the conclusion that we need to approach this differently." "What did you have in mind?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew where this was heading. "We want to ask you to forgive the debt," Mom said, jumping in with the kind of nervous energy that suggested she was delivering a rehearsed speech. "As a family gesture that would allow us to start fresh and work together without all this financial complexity creating problems between us." I stared at them for a moment, trying to process what they were actually asking. They wanted me to write off $1.8 million plus accrued interest and penalties, essentially giving them a gift of nearly $2 million, so that they could continue operating the business exactly as they had been, without any changes to management, strategy, or operational practices. "Let me make sure I understand," I said slowly. "You want me to absorb a $2 million loss so that Nathaniel can continue running a business model that loses money every month, without any oversight or accountability measures that might prevent this situation from happening again?" "We want you to trust us to work things out as a family," Nathaniel said, his voice carrying an edge of desperation that suggested he knew how unreasonable this request was, but couldn't think of any alternatives. "And what happens when the next crisis arrives?" I asked. "When the remaining creditors start demanding payment, or when the equipment leases come due, or when your largest client decides to switch to a cheaper competitor? Do I forgive those debts too? Do I keep subsidizing operational losses indefinitely?" "We'll figure it out," Dad said, with the kind of wishful thinking that had created this problem in the first place. "No," I said, standing up from my chair and walking to the window that overlooked downtown Millbrook Heights. "You won't figure it out, because figuring it out requires acknowledging realities that you're not willing to acknowledge. It requires making changes that you're not willing to make. And it requires accepting help in ways that you're apparently not capable of accepting." I turned back to face them, and for the first time in this entire process, I let them see how frustrated and disappointed I really was. For 30 years, I've watched this family make decisions based on wishful thinking and emotional attachments, rather than objective analysis and strategic planning. I've watched you ignore problems until they became crises, and then look for miracle solutions that would allow you to avoid making difficult choices. And now, when someone finally has the expertise and resources to actually solve your problems, you want me to just give you money and walk away so you can continue making the same mistakes that got you into this mess. The silence that followed was different from the stunned quiet of our previous confrontations. This was the silence of people who were finally beginning to understand that their old methods of negotiating and manipulating weren't going to work in this situation. "The offers I made last Saturday are still on the table," I continued. "But they're not negotiable, and they're not going to be modified to make them more comfortable for you. You have 6 more days to choose one of the 3 options, or I start foreclosure proceedings. Those are the only choices you have." As they filed out of my office, I realized that I had crossed a line from which there would be no return. I was no longer Elena the daughter who was trying to help her family. I was Elena the creditor who was imposing terms on debtors who had run out of alternatives. And while that transformation gave me the power to save Clearwater Maritime, it might also cost me the relationships that had defined my entire life. The weekend before the deadline arrived, with an eerie quiet that felt like the calm before a hurricane. For 6 days, I heard nothing from my family. No phone calls, no surprise visits, no attempts at negotiation or manipulation. It was as if they had collectively decided to pretend that our ultimatum didn't exist, that somehow ignoring the deadline would make it disappear. I spent those days in a strange state of suspended animation, going through the motions of my normal routine while knowing that everything was about to change irrevocably. I reviewed client files without really absorbing the information, attended video conferences where I contributed just enough to seem engaged, and maintained my investment portfolio with the mechanical precision of someone whose mind was entirely focused elsewhere. But I also used that time to prepare for all 3 possible outcomes. I finalized the liquidation analysis that would maximize asset recovery if they chose option 1. I completed the operational restructuring plan that would transform Clearwater Maritime into a lean, profitable enterprise if they selected option 2. And I finished the comprehensive business transformation strategy that would position the company for long-term growth if they were willing to accept option 3. Most importantly, I prepared myself emotionally for the possibility that they might choose none of the above, that they might simply let the deadline pass and force me to initiate foreclosure proceedings against my own family's business. It was a scenario I dreaded, but I had learned enough about myself over the past few weeks to know that I wouldn't back down from the position I had established, even if it meant destroying relationships that had defined my entire life. The call came at 4:47 p.m. on Monday afternoon, exactly 13 minutes before my self-imposed 5 p.m. deadline. It was Dad, and his voice had a quality I had never heard before. Not the confident authority of the family patriarch, not the desperate pleading of someone trying to negotiate impossible terms, but the resigned acceptance of someone who had finally run out of alternatives. "Elena," he said, "we've made our decision. We want to discuss the terms of option 2, the debt restructuring with new management oversight." I felt a mixture of relief and apprehension wash over me. Relief because they had chosen the option that would save the company and preserve something of value for everyone involved. Apprehension because option 2 was also the most complex alternative, requiring fundamental changes to how Clearwater Maritime operated and how our family related to each other. "I'm glad you called," I said, pulling up the detailed implementation plan I had prepared for exactly this scenario. "Can we meet tomorrow morning to go over the specifics? This is going to involve some significant adjustments, and I want to make sure everyone understands what they're committing to." "Actually," Dad said, his voice getting quieter, "we were hoping we could meet tonight, at the house. There are some things we need to say to you before we start talking about business terms." An hour later, I was sitting in the same dining room where this entire saga had begun 18 months earlier, but the atmosphere couldn't have been more different. Instead of the nervous optimism that had characterized that first conversation about the coastal logistics acquisition, there was a somber gravity that felt like a funeral for the family dynamics we had all grown up with. Mom had prepared coffee and set out the good china, as if this were a special occasion that deserved formal treatment. Dad was wearing his best dress shirt again, but this time he looked like someone who was attending an important meeting, rather than someone who was trying to maintain illusions about his circumstances. And Nathaniel was sitting across from me with an expression that I couldn't quite read, part resignation, part curiosity, and something that might have been the beginning of genuine respect. "Elena," Dad began, "before we talk about business arrangements, we owe you some apologies. We owe you acknowledgement for things we should have recognized years ago. And we owe you honesty about mistakes we've been making as a family." I nodded but didn't respond, sensing that this was a conversation they needed to have rather than one they were expecting me to participate in. "For your entire adult life," he continued, "we've treated you like you were peripheral to this family's most important decisions. We assumed that because you didn't ask to be involved in the business, you weren't interested in contributing to its success. We took your independence as a sign that you didn't need our attention or support, and we never bothered to learn about your professional expertise because we thought we already understood what you were capable of." Mom picked up the thread, her voice shaky with emotion. "We were so focused on preserving the legacy your father built that we couldn't see how much stronger that legacy could become with your involvement. We were so worried about maintaining traditions that we ignored opportunities to adapt and improve. And we were so comfortable with our old ways of doing things that we didn't recognize how much the world had changed around us." Nathaniel spoke last, and his words carried a weight that suggested he had been thinking about this conversation for days. "I've been angry with you for the past 2 weeks," he said, "because finding out that you were our creditor felt like discovering that you had been lying to us. But the truth is, I've been lying to myself about my capabilities and our situation for much longer than you've been keeping secrets about your involvement." He paused, running his hands through his hair in a gesture I remembered from our childhood when he was struggling with difficult homework assignments. "I took over this company because I thought it was my birthright, not because I had earned the position or demonstrated that I could handle the responsibilities. I made decisions based on what I wanted to believe rather than what the evidence was telling me. And I accepted financing on terms I didn't understand, because I was too proud to admit that I needed help from people who knew more than I did. The honesty in his voice was startling, because it represented a level of self-awareness that I hadn't expected from someone who had spent his entire life being told he was destined for success. "When you revealed that you were our biggest creditor," he continued, "my first reaction was to feel betrayed and manipulated. But over the past week, I've realized that you were actually protecting us from my mistakes, while giving me opportunities to learn from them. You could have forced us into bankruptcy 8 months ago, but instead you provided financing that kept us afloat while I figured out how bad our situation really was." Dad leaned forward, his expression more serious than I had ever seen it. "What we're trying to say, Elena, is that we understand now that you've been the most responsible person in this family for a long time. You've been preparing for challenges that we refuse to acknowledge. You've been developing expertise that we didn't appreciate. And you've been positioning yourself to help us in ways that we weren't mature enough to accept. So when we agreed to option 2, Mom added, we're not just accepting your financial terms, we're accepting your leadership. We're acknowledging that you understand this business and this industry better than we do. And we're committing to following your guidance, even when it means making changes that feel uncomfortable or unfamiliar." I sat there absorbing what they had just said, recognizing that this conversation represented a fundamental shift in our family's power structure that went far beyond business arrangements. They weren't just agreeing to debt restructuring. They were agreeing to treat me as the primary decision-maker for something that had been the center of their lives for over 3 decades. "There's something else you need to understand," I said finally. "Option 2 isn't just about financial restructuring. It's about transforming Clearwater Maritime into a completely different kind of company. We're going to eliminate services that aren't profitable, even if they're services that Dad pioneered. We're going to automate processes that currently require manual labor, which means some longtime employees are going to lose their jobs. And we're going to prioritize efficiency and competitiveness over personal relationships and community connections." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of everything they were giving up in order to save what could be saved. "We understand," Dad said quietly. "And we're ready to make those changes, as long as you're willing to help us through the transition." As I drove home that night, I realized that I had gotten everything I had been working toward for the past 3 years. I had the authority to save Clearwater Maritime, the family's respect for my expertise, and the opportunity to prove that my vision for the company's future was worth the pain of getting there. But I also realized that success was going to feel very different from what I had imagined when this all began. The transformation of Clearwater Maritime Solutions from a failing family business into a profitable logistics operation took 18 months and felt like performing surgery on a patient who was awake and watching every incision. Every decision I made affected people I had known my entire life. Every operational change eliminated traditions that my family had spent decades building, and every improvement came at the cost of something that had once made the company feel like home. The first 6 months were the most brutal. I moved back to Millbrook Heights permanently and took over the day-to-day operations, while Nathaniel transitioned into a sales and client relations role that matched his strengths without exposing the company to his weaknesses in financial management. Dad remained as an advisor and ceremonial president, but his actual decision-making authority was limited to employee relations and community outreach activities. Mom stepped back entirely from business operations, focusing instead on managing the family's personal finances and supporting Dad through what was essentially a forced retirement from meaningful involvement in his life's work. The operational changes were as painful as I had predicted. We eliminated the specialty importing services that had been Dad's pride and joy, but generated less than 8% of our revenue while consuming 23% of our operational resources. We automated the inventory management system, which eliminated 4 full-time positions and forced us to lay off employees who had worked for the company for over a decade. We canceled the equipment leases that were draining our cash flow and switched to a model where we rented specialized machinery only when specific contracts required it. Most difficult of all, we sold the original warehouse complex that Dad had bought in 1987 and moved to a smaller, more efficient facility in the industrial park outside town. The new building had better technology infrastructure and lower operational costs, but it lacked the character and history that had made Clearwater Maritime feel like a family legacy rather than just another business. The human cost of these changes was something I had anticipated intellectually but wasn't prepared for emotionally. Maria Santos, who had managed our customer service department for 15 years, broke down crying when I told her that her position was being eliminated in favor of an automated phone system and email-based support. Tommy Rodriguez, who had operated our forklift equipment since 1998, shook his head in disappointment when I explained that we were outsourcing our warehouse operations to a third-party logistics provider. But the hardest conversation was with Dad, 3 months into the restructuring process, when he asked me if I thought we were destroying everything good about the company in order to save the parts that could generate profit. "Elena," he said, sitting in my new office that occupied a quarter of the space his old office had commanded, "I know these changes are necessary, and I know you're doing what needs to be done. But sometimes, I drive past the old building, and I think about all the people we used to employ, all the relationships we used to maintain, all the ways we used to contribute to this community, and I wonder if what we're building now is worth what we had to tear down to get here."
It was a question I had been asking myself every day since taking control of the company, and I didn't have a satisfying answer for him. What I could offer was data. Our monthly losses had decreased from $43,000 to $12,000 in the first quarter, then turned into a modest profit of $8,000 per month by the second quarter. Our debt service obligations were now manageable, our operational efficiency had improved by 37%, and our client retention rate had actually increased because we were focusing on services we could deliver reliably, rather than trying to be everything to everyone. "Dad," I said, "the company you built was amazing for its time, but the world changed around it. We could either adapt to those changes and preserve what was most valuable about your vision, or we could stick to the old model and watch everything disappear when the bankruptcy court liquidated our assets." He nodded, but I could see in his eyes that he understood the logic without fully accepting the emotional reality of what that logic had cost us. The real vindication came in month 12, when we landed our first major contract with Apex Manufacturing, a company that needed precisely the kind of streamlined, technology-enabled logistics services that our restructured operation could provide. The contract was worth $1.8 million annually, nearly 60% of our previous peak revenue, and it required capabilities that the old Clearwater Maritime never could have delivered. By month 15, we had added 2 more contracts of similar scope, our monthly profit had grown to $47,000, and we were actually turning away potential clients because we couldn't expand our capacity fast enough to meet demand. The lean, efficient operation that had felt like a betrayal of Dad's legacy was generating more profit than the original company had ever achieved, while serving clients who valued precision and reliability over personal relationships and community connections. The final milestone came in month 18, when I was able to convert my outstanding debt to a 49% equity stake in the restructured company, making me the largest single shareholder while preserving majority control for my family. Nathaniel retained a 31% stake, Dad and Mom shared 15%, and the remaining 5% was allocated to an employee profit-sharing plan that gave our reduced but highly skilled workforce a direct financial interest in the company's continued success. But the most meaningful moment wasn't reaching profitability or securing major contracts or achieving financial stability. It was the conversation I had with Nathaniel in December, almost exactly 2 years after the original family dinner, that had started this entire process. We were working late on a proposal for a potential client, and he looked up from his laptop with an expression that combined exhaustion with something that might have been satisfaction. "You know what's funny?" he said. 2 years ago, I thought success meant proving that I could run this company exactly the way Dad had run it. I thought preserving his legacy meant keeping everything the same and just working harder to make it profitable. "And now?" I asked. Now I realize that preserving his legacy actually meant preserving what made it valuable. The commitment to reliable service, the focus on solving problems for our clients, the pride in building something that contributes to the community's economic foundation. Everything else was just details that could be changed when circumstances required it. He paused, saving his work and closing the laptop. I also realized that I never could have made these changes myself. even if I had understood what needed to be done. I was too emotionally attached to the old ways of doing things, and I didn't have the expertise or objectivity to implement systematic operational improvements. "Does that bother you?" I asked, knowing that someone else had to save the company you were supposed to inherit. He considered the question for a moment before answering. "It bothered me for a long time," he said, "but what bothers me more is thinking about what would have happened if you hadn't been prepared to intervene. We would have lost everything: the business, the building, Dad's legacy, our family's financial security, everything. At least this way, we preserved what was most important while adapting what needed to be changed." That conversation marked the end of our family's old dynamics and the beginning of something that felt more honest and sustainable. We were no longer a traditional family business where authority was inherited and decisions were made based on emotional attachments rather than objective analysis. We were a partnership between people who had learned to respect each other's strengths and acknowledge each other's limitations.
The final financial accounting was completed in January of this year. Clearwater Maritime Solutions had generated $2.3 million in revenue during our first full year under the new operational model, with net profits of $487,000 and cash reserves sufficient to fund planned expansion into 2 additional service areas. The company that had been losing $43,000 per month when I took control was now generating enough profit to support my parents' retirement, provide competitive salaries for all employees, and fund growth initiatives that would position us for long-term success in a changing market. But more than the financial metrics, what I was most proud of was that we had saved something worth saving while learning to work together as adults who treated each other with genuine respect and collaborative partnership. It hadn't been the legacy that Dad had envisioned when he started the company, but it was a legacy that could survive and thrive in the world we actually inhabited, rather than the world he had hoped would never change. As I sit here today, looking out the window of my office at the bustling operations of what Clearwater Maritime Solutions has become, I'm struck by how different my life looks from what I imagined 3 years ago when this journey began. I never set out to become the CEO of my family's company. I never planned to hold my brother's future in my hands, or force my parents to confront the limitations of their traditional business model. I certainly never expected to discover that the most effective way to help people you love sometimes involves making decisions they'll initially hate you for. But here's what I've learned from this experience that I think applies to anyone who's ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or taken for granted by the people closest to them. Your worth isn't determined by other people's recognition of your capabilities. Your value doesn't depend on being chosen, celebrated, or included in decisions that affect your life. And your power to create positive change often exists independently of whether anyone asks for your help or acknowledges your contributions. The biggest mistake I could have made would have been to sit back and wait for my family to suddenly develop the insight to appreciate my skills and invite me to participate in solving their problems. That recognition was never going to come naturally, because people who are struggling with crises tend to double down on familiar approaches, rather than seeking out perspectives that challenge their assumptions. They were never going to ask me to take over the company's financial management, because they had spent 30 years convincing themselves that financial management wasn't the real problem. Instead, I had to create my own opportunity to make a difference by positioning myself strategically and developing leverage that couldn't be ignored when the inevitable crisis arrived. I had to become indispensable before anyone realized they needed me to be indispensable. And I had to accept that helping my family might require forcing them to accept help in ways that initially felt threatening rather than supportive. That's a lesson that extends far beyond family businesses and financial restructuring. How many of you have watched people you care about make destructive decisions while refusing to listen to advice that could help them? How many of you have been excluded from conversations where your expertise could have prevented expensive mistakes? How many of you have been treated as peripheral to decisions that directly affected your own interests and well-being? The conventional wisdom in those situations is usually to respect other people's autonomy, offer support when asked, and hope that things work out for the best. But conventional wisdom assumes that people are rational actors, who will eventually recognize their limitations and seek appropriate help. In reality, pride, fear, and emotional attachment to familiar patterns often prevent people from making objectively good decisions, even when the stakes are catastrophically high. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to refuse to enable their self-destructive choices. Sometimes helping people requires making yourself powerful enough to impose better alternatives when they're incapable of choosing those alternatives themselves. And sometimes preserving relationships requires fundamentally changing the power dynamics that created unhealthy patterns in the first place. I'm not suggesting that everyone should become their family's secret creditor or manipulate financial situations to gain leverage over people they care about. What I am suggesting is that if you have expertise, resources, or insights that could genuinely help people you love, you don't have to wait for permission to start positioning yourself to be useful when they finally recognize that they need help. Maybe that means quietly developing the skills and connections that would allow you to intervene if someone's career goes off track. Maybe it means building financial reserves that could provide stability if someone's business ventures fail. Maybe it means staying informed about industries, markets, or legal issues that could affect your family's long-term security. The specific strategies don't matter as much as the mindset, taking responsibility for outcomes that matter to you, rather than hoping that other people will take appropriate responsibility for those same outcomes. The hardest part of my journey wasn't the financial analysis, the legal maneuvering, or even the confrontational family meetings, where I had to reveal uncomfortable truths about our situation. The hardest part was accepting that I couldn't save my family's business without also fundamentally changing our family's relationships. The version of myself that could successfully restructure a failing company wasn't the same version of myself that had quietly accepted being overlooked and undervalued for most of my adult life. I had to become someone who prioritized effectiveness over harmony, someone who insisted on respect rather than accepting affection as a substitute for recognition, and someone who was willing to be temporarily disliked in service of long-term outcomes that everyone would eventually appreciate. That transformation was necessary for saving Clearwater Maritime, but it also made it impossible for our family to return to the comfortable but dysfunctional patterns that had defined our interactions for decades. Today, my relationship with my parents and brother is healthier than it's ever been, but it's also more formal, more businesslike, and more explicitly based on mutual respect rather than unconditional love. We work together effectively because we've learned to acknowledge each other's strengths and limitations honestly. We make decisions collaboratively because we've established clear roles and responsibilities that reflect our actual capabilities rather than our traditional family hierarchy. It's a better foundation for long-term success, but it required giving up the illusion that family love could overcome structural problems or that good intentions could substitute for competent execution. Some of you might find that trade-off unacceptable. Some of you might prefer to maintain harmonious relationships, even if it means watching people you care about make preventable mistakes. But if you're someone who's tired of being underestimated, if you're frustrated by watching preventable problems destroy things you care about, if you're ready to stop hoping that other people will suddenly develop the wisdom to appreciate your contributions, then maybe it's time to start building your own leverage and creating your own opportunities to make a difference. The people in your life might not ask for your help until they're desperate enough to have no other choice. They might not recognize your value until you've positioned yourself to be indispensable, and they might not treat you with respect until you've demonstrated that disrespect comes with consequences they can't afford to accept. That's not manipulation. That's strategic thinking applied to relationships that matter. That's taking responsibility for outcomes instead of just hoping for the best. And that's recognizing that sometimes the most effective way to help people is to make it impossible for them to continue making destructive choices. Your family, your friends, your colleagues, they don't have to choose to value your contributions. But you can choose to make those contributions valuable enough that ignoring them becomes impossible. You can choose to develop expertise that creates opportunities, and you can choose to position yourself strategically so that when crises inevitably arrive, you're ready to provide solutions that couldn't have come from anyone else. The overlooked daughter doesn't have to stay overlooked forever. Sometimes she just has to become the creditor. So here's my challenge to you. Stop waiting for recognition and start building power. Stop hoping for inclusion and start creating value that can't be ignored. Stop accepting whatever role other people assign to you and start positioning yourself to write your own script when the time comes. And if you found this story useful, if it resonated with your own experiences of being underestimated or overlooked, then share it with someone who needs to hear it. Hit that subscribe button for more stories about people who refuse to accept the limitations that others tried to impose on them. Because the world needs more people who understand that helping others sometimes requires being strong enough to save them from themselves. The most important lesson I learned isn't that family businesses are complicated or that financial expertise is valuable. It's that your worth isn't determined by other people's ability to recognize it, and your power to create positive change is limited only by your willingness to do what's necessary to make that change happen, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's difficult, and even when the people you're trying to help initially resist your efforts. Sometimes being overlooked is just preparation for the moment when you reveal that you are actually the most important person in the room all along. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.